Some of you may have been around by then. I can see from your white hair that you're like me. You remember the 1990s was a stock market explosion. It went crazy. And of course, I mean that literally. It went crazy. Companies that had never made a profit were suddenly selling shares for $200, $400, $500 a share. Wild. And then in the spring of 2000, that bubble burst. And the stock market has never recovered. 2000, year 2000, March, blew up. So frightened was our government that they quickly dropped interest rates. Why? Because they wanted Americans to borrow more money. Let me say that again. Given the history I've just told you, the United States government dropped the interest rates catastrophically in 2001, 2002, 2003 to stimulate Americans to borrow more, which, given what I told you, of course, we did. And so we then had a real estate boom that became a bubble that collapsed. We're out of bubbles. There is no more. So we come to 2007, and the wealthy don't want to invest anywhere. They've been twice whacked by the stock market collapse in 2000 and by the real estate collapse starting in 2007. They don't want to invest their money. And the mass of the working class is exhausted. They can't do more hours of work. They literally haven't got the energy. And they can't borrow any more money because they're already carrying debt they can't afford. So the working class, which is the vast majority, can't move forward, can't continue. And the wealthy have been twice whacked by their own speculations, and so they're shell-shocked, they're not playing. And so our economy collapses. And we have mass unemployment. And everybody loses. What is being done? Mr. Bush and Mr. Obama are basically doing more or less the same thing. Mr. Obama at a bigger scale. First thing, get the financial sector of our economy going again, because it froze. Nobody would lend money to anybody. Nobody trusted anybody. All the big banks were defunct. It's important that you understand, all the big banks in the United States are now dependent on the government. We call them private banks, but they're not. They depend on the government bailing them all out. The largest insurance company in the world, AIG is the name of it, is now 80% owned by the United States government, which bailed it out. The United States government is now directly financing 90% of every mortgage written in the United States. So if you go and get a mortgage now, 90%, 9 out of 10 times, anyone gets a mortgage now, and it's hard to get one. The person who's ultimately providing the money is the United States government. There's no housing industry in the United States without the government, there's no banking, and there's effectively no insurance. To call this a private enterprise economy is done in the United States only because we find it so difficult to admit it, that it isn't one. We need to believe in that. So that even though the private enterprise economy blows up on us, we need to believe it's still there. So we bail out the banks with huge amounts of money. Huge. We take over the insurance company. We bail out our largest automobile company, General Motors. The private giants of our industry are all now welfare cases, dependent on the government. Trillions with a T spent on this. If the government spends trillions of dollars, the decision that is interesting that you ought to think about is, what does the government do with that money, and where does the money come from? Let's do first where the money goes. How do you get the economy going again? Bush and Obama decided the way you do that is you pour money into the banks. Here was the idea. If you pour money into the banks, then we can, I'm going to quote now, kickstart the economy, because with the money going into the banks will hopefully turn around and lend it, and people will borrow it, and they'll buy stuff, and that'll give people jobs, and it'll all work out. What happened? The government did it, gave the money to the banks in a variety of ways, and if you're interested later, we can discuss all of that. But the banks took the money. Thank you very much. Very much. Very excited about getting that money. But they didn't lend it to anybody. And when the government came and said, you know, the whole plan was we give you the money, then you lend it. And the banks said, you must be crazy. Lending the money is what got us into this mess in the first place. We're not going to take the next money we get and do it again. Moreover, those workers, they can't pay back what we already lent them. We're not going to lend them anymore. And we're not going to lend it to any company because we know with all these unemployed workers, those companies aren't going to have anybody to sell the stuff to. So they're not a good risk either. We're holding on to the money. So what have we got? Banks who are doing real well, they got a lot of money, but nobody else is doing real well. Wasn't the greatest idea. What else could they have done? Well, here's something. Here's a thought. Suppose the government said, if the private economy of the United States can't provide 15, 20, 25 million Americans with a job, then the government itself will do that. We'll hire the people. And guess what? If the government hired the people, which by the way would have cost less money than was given to the banks, if the government hired the people, those people would have an income. And if they had an income, they could make their mortgage payments. And they could pay taxes, so you wouldn't have to cut the courses here at Berkeley College. And in case you think that's a wild idea, or a socialist idea, or a communist idea, or an idea from Mars, let me remind you, in the 1930s, that last time that we had a crisis like this, the then president of the United States, a Democrat named Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in 1933, guess what he did? He hired millions and millions of Americans to work for the government. So this is not an idea I invented. This is not an idea from Russia. This is an idea from our own country's history. And you might be interested to know what the two biggest programs were that Franklin Delano Roosevelt hired people for. One was called the Civilian Conservation Corps. They went around, way back then, doing what we would now call green projects. They redesigned rivers and they replanted forests. They built lots of highways. They built many of the national parks that you enjoy visiting. That was the government hiring unemployed people to give them the work. Even better was another project you may never have heard of, called the WPA. Wonderful program. Here's what the government did. It said anybody who's got any artistic talent, if you're unemployed singer or an actor or a puppeteer or a whatever, sculptor, painter, come to this office, we the government will hire you. So the government hired, you ready? Hundreds of thousands of artists. Paid them a salary so they could pay off their mortgage, pay taxes and everything else. And they put together teams, troops of actors and painters and you name it. And it paid them to travel around the United States bringing opera and theater and painting classes to all over the United States. Big cities, small towns. It was the greatest delivery of culture to the American people we ever had. We've never had anything like that before, and we've never had it since. There was an interesting idea of how to put people to work. It's interesting for you to think. We did that the last time. We aren't even discussing it as a nation now. There's no bill that is working its way through the Congress. There wasn't one last year, and there isn't one now to do this. So could it be done? Sure it could. It wasn't done. We bailed out banks and insurance companies. They're doing great. Because interest rates are so low, the government does that. The banks have all this money, they are lending it to somebody. Any of you know who? Who's borrowing? The people who, no, the government is borrowing, that's correct. But the other people borrowing are stock market investors, which is why the stock market is going up, because you can borrow money for almost nothing, and that takes much of the risk out of buying stocks. So we have a bank boom and a stock market boom, and a disaster for everybody else. Now, where did the government get the money? Here comes the best part. There are three ways for the government to get money, to do anything. That includes bailing out a collapsed capitalist economy. the first thing the government can do is tax people. That's how the government raises money. But if you think Mr. Obama or Mr. Bush became unpopular when there was an economic collapse, imagine how the American people would have felt if the government said, we're going to bail out the banks, and we're going to help the stock market, and in order to do that,